I'm gonna accept.
All my two are just. Oh, you're not in. I always think you're in that class. No. It's funny because almost I never get the APs. No, it's just Snapchat. I open it up and she's like, good morning or something. I was like, don't you have the cow test today? AP cow test.
So is she or she's not? Or she can take it.
You have to sign up. Like, you have to know in advance that you're not going to take it.
I think they still say, like, if you say something, they'll let you take it. I'm pretty sure.
I don't know. I just kind of like.
Too big a killer.
120 to know. Are you kidding me?
True. Where were you yesterday? You were on the whole day.
I was going to.
Give me 1 second, I'm having trouble with the computer. Okay, so we were writing Yalta and talking about the Security Council, correct?
Yes.
Why do you hate me, computer? I know none of you are coming to my aid, saying the computer doesn't hate you.
The computer doesn't.
No, machines hate everything. It's the start of an uprising. Did you watch iRobot?
Did you watch iRobot? I read it.
Have you seen the movie?
Yeah, I've seen the movie.
Okay. Because I was gonna say, if you haven't,
The book is way better.
the movie is a waste of.
Oh yeah, I guess.
And it infuriates me anytime it comes up. My dad's like, "Oh, let's take a movie. Let's watch it." I'm like, "It's a movie."
I mean, the book is so much better. Like the first story in the book is like Robbie the Robot. It like made me cry. It was awesome.
Okay, where are we tardy? I remember we were right on Yalta, and Yalta did the Security Council, and the General Assembly can only just advise, essentially. How many seats in the Security Council did Russia have? 3. Who was the commander of Allied forces at D-Day?
Bernard Montgomery.
Montgomery was the actual commander of the forces. Who is the overall commander?
Eisenhower.
Yep.
I like you knew that yesterday.
Well, he posted the video on YouTube.
Oh, I didn't record it.
Oh, I gotta record this. Yeah, and I gotta record this because I told Brian I would. Who thinks I should record it for Brian? Raise your hand. Sorry, Brian.
He doesn't need it.
Who does he think he is?
Yeah. What are you thinking?
I was thinking about taking that, and I was like, nah.
Okay, so
First of all, I'm not in math.
I did the practice.
where'd it go? Are we having an emergency? I lost it.
What?
Your mind?
Yeah, I was waiting for someone to say that.
First name says it should die.
Off to the gulag with you.
It's gone.
I'm not even mad. That'd be nice.
Gulag would not be nice. It's suffering.
You ever have one? I think it's in back.
Yesterday, so we talked capital punishment a little yesterday.
Rabbit.
And then we talked about like different execution styles and sort of and making that since
Ah, I bet someone did.
There, fine, throw you out of the way.
Okay, so that was Yalta. Or what was the last German counterattack in the West called?
The Battle of Algeria.
Yeah, the Battle of the Bulge, which went to be America's biggest victory. They attacked in the winter.
This is mine.
And let's see, what else? What more fun things can I ask? No, yes. Because someone walked in right in the middle of that. And why did the Allies, even though they took France after the breakout in Normandy, what was the big problem when they got to the German border? Yeah, they were out of supplies completely. And so when they did finally break through, it would not be until the end of or beginning of spring. And when did the British bomb?
Night.
When did the Americans bomb?
Day.
And one thing about that, they bombed Berlin and then Dresden, Hamburg with fire bombs, and then the Americans would take that strategy to Japan and totally destroy virtually every Japanese city with fire bombs. Well before the atomic bomb was ever dropped. Okay, so Yalta. We have the Security Council, the United Nations, but remember the Security Council is basically, I'm glad we can make it.
Me too.
Okay, good. And why is the Security Council unable to do pretty much anything controversial?
Because of the veto.
Yeah, the veto that the five powers, or the five great powers have. And by the way, now, it's pretty controversial because here's Germany with, in fact, they're the biggest exporting country in the world, one of the richest countries in the world, and they say, why don't we have a permanent seat? Japan saying the same thing. Brazil saying the same thing. Swaziland saying the same thing. And so, back to Yalta then. The next part about Yalta, which would be important, is that what about the fate of Eastern Europe? What about the fate? And Stalin would agree to the Declaration of Rights in Eastern Europe. But what we need to know about this for Eastern Europe is Stalin promised free elections. Especially Poland, which is pretty hypocritical considering what happened at Warsaw, when Stalin purposely allowed the Home Guard in Warsaw to be destroyed to make sure that his type of government would go in there. Now, he promised it. Roosevelt, who was by then very ill, assumed that Stalin would basically stand by his word. Churchill already believed he wouldn't. Churchill and Stalin had already secretly, 3 months before, had divvied up Eastern Europe into what's called spheres of influence. They've already divvied it up, and Roosevelt did not know about this. In fact, Churchill was desperately trying to keep Britain relevant. Britain was so weak by years of war. And so they had this very elaborate idea of, for example, Greece would be 100% Britain. Bulgaria would be 90-10. Romania 60-40, Soviet influence. Yugoslavia 70-30, Soviet influence. I don't even know what that means. They were just coming up with numbers. What?
I can't tell if you're being serious.
No, I'm being very serious. Yeah, they divvied it up, literally the percentage of influence. And Stalin's like, whatever. When Stalin took it, he's going to stay. Now, Stalin always was a realist, and he looked at this like, yes, this sounds good, we're going to save free elections for the people. But he thought Churchill and Roosevelt understood this is all a scam. And no way was the Soviet Union ever going to allow governments in Eastern Europe to be anything other than friends of the Soviet Union. And so that is a fatal misunderstanding. Out of Yalta came this agreement for free elections, but Stalin always believed, nah, I'm going to do what I want. And he thought Churchill understood this, and he thought this was just for show. And so after the war, Yalta is going to be very controversial because of that issue. Next, Germany. At Yalta, they decided to divide Germany up into 3 occupation zones, but Britain and the U.S. said, well, France needs one too. And so even though Yalta, Stalin said, I only agree to 3. What came out of this was 4 occupation zones. In fact, it was a 4-power agreement for Germany. Germany would be divided up into the victorious allies. Soviets, Britain, United States, and France. But not only Germany, also Austria. Austria would be divided up 4 ways, and almost as importantly, their capitals. Vienna, okay, but the big one is Berlin. Berlin would be divided up into 4 occupation zones. Now, Austria would not try to be a big deal. 10 years after the war, all 4 powers agreed to leave Austria, and it became a neutral country. So Austria was neutral, technically, even though it was pretty closely allied to the West. But in Germany, it was significantly different. And one of the key elements is Berlin is going to be in the middle of the Soviet occupation zone. That means there's going to be British, American, and French occupation zones, what we're soon going to call West Berlin, and that's going to be a little island within the Soviet occupation zone, which will soon be called East Germany. And so West Berlin, that occupied zone, would become the symbol of the Cold War. West Berlin. When I was growing up, it was always West Berlin, West Berlin. And this would be complex. Oh, and one more thing. There would be corridors. A rail, road, and air corridor for each of the occupations, Allied occupation zones. So a French corridor, a British corridor, and an American corridor. It wasn't like it was walled off. Basically what it meant is this is the area designated for the Americans to resupply their occupying forces. So right after Germany surrendered, approximately a month after, even though the Soviets took and conquered Berlin, they had to give up part of Berlin for the Americans came in, and Mr. Long's dad, the math teacher upstairs, it was his brigade of the 2nd Armored Division, actually it was regiment then, his regiment that would be the first American forces to enter it. So Mr. Long's dad was one of the first to go in. And he'll come talk to us in 2 weeks in special topics. It'll be really cool. But Berlin would be occupied. With the idea that sometime down the road they would unify. Everyone got that? Sometime down the road. And it would be open borders. This was not meant to be separate countries. Ideally, you could cross back and forth. You could go from west to east anytime you wanted. This was never meant to be a permanent border. The assumption was when Germany unconditionally surrendered, there'd be a vacuum of power, and we need something in there to govern it. It was never meant to be separate countries. Never. Of course, that's what I am going to grow up, and you've probably heard and read about West and East Berlin and West and East Germany. Next, reparations. The Allies promised at least $20 billion in reparations for Germany. I mean, from Germany to the Soviet Union. Everyone got that? Why got that? 20 billion. Now, before I answer your question, Churchill and Roosevelt were very reluctant because of the problems reparations caused after Versailles. They're like, oh, I don't know if we want to do this. And especially when in the process, while they're meeting, they're destroying Germany, bombing, and then they'll be fighting in there. But Stalin demanded it because, for good reason, this area of the Soviet Union was a wasteland, an absolute wasteland because of the fighting there. Also, the Americans and the British never acknowledged what the Soviets went through. Never.
Yeah. Who put in Germany's, West Germany's government? Which ally? Was it Britain?
It was U.S., Britain, and France. It was the three powers of the West.
Okay, because it's most like Britain's. So
no, their government is actually very close to the Weimar government.
Yeah.
So that goes back to the original Frankfurt Assembly. Remember that in 1848? It's basically taking that template. So yeah, it's based on that. They just got rid of a few of the flaws, like that whole dictator thing and a few other things. So they were very cleverly using it as close as they can to the old system. Okay. The U.S. did the same thing in Japan after World War II, as close as they could to the 1920s Japanese government. Okay, one last thing. The U.S. was very concerned that Japan would continue to fight. And so Russia agreed 3 months after the war 3 months after VE Day to attack Japan. And they gave Russia all sorts of stuff. Promised them islands and things that Japan got in the Russo-Japanese War. Remember that from 1905? Going to give them all of this because the United States was concerned that Japan might fight on for years and they wanted Russian forces. The U.S. would change their mind when it was clear Japan was absolutely defeated by June of 1945. But in January 1945, they wanted Russian men. Okay, so that's Yalta. And almost immediately, what happened in Eastern Europe? Almost immediately. In fact, while the meeting was going on,
No free elections.
no free elections. Stalin is putting in Stalinist governments. Now, technically, in Hungary, Romania, and Czechoslovakia, when Czechoslovakia was going to be liberated, actually at the same time as Berlin fell, technically, Stalin is going to set up or allow for free governments, but they make sure that every other contestant for a new government, every other idea, they would either be squashed or even arrested, the leaders of it, to make sure that Stalinist governments would take power. It happened almost immediately. Almost immediately. But Poland was the biggie because of what happened in Warsaw. And the reason why, therefore, Yalta would be important, what city did Chamberlain, Daladier, Hitler, and Mussolini meet to talk about the fate of Czechoslovakia in 1948? What? Munich. And remember, Munich, what do you call giving into aggression?
Appeasement.
Appeasement. Yalta, after the war, by many people, rabid anti-communists, soon they're going to be called Cold Warriors, are going to equate Yalta to Munich, which equals appeasement.
Wait, who's doing this?
The rabid Cold Warriors who feared the expansion of the Soviet Union after the war. Roosevelt was assassin, or maybe even Roosevelt was a spy. And so this gets the whole Pinko thing. Where'd I put my stapler?
I wouldn't know.
I assume you're coming in the hand, your paper's in. Staple it.
I just wanted you to look at it. I wasn't going to let you, like, read it or anything.
Give it to me.
I don't think my name's on it.
Write your name. Okay.
Can I put your brainstorm this first? Oh, my brainstorm list is on the bottom.
Okay, so.
Thanks.
And then just set it on my chair. And this is key, because this idea that somehow the United States was cheated at Yalta. Cheated, not allowed to, or Roosevelt was cheated, and the Soviet Union prepared to take much of Eastern Europe. Thanks. And so, Yalta would be key, and that's why the next meeting after the war ended would be at Potsdam. Potsdam, that's beautiful Potsdam. It's right outside of Berlin. That's where the Hohenzollern monarchs originally were. For example, Frederick William the Elector, the first one to make Prussia into a prominent state in the Holy Roman Empire. That's on your list. But Frederick the Great, they had their palace in Potsdam. Neat town, if you get a chance to go. It's a city of gates. They have those big, huge gates all over the town. They met in Potsdam at a spa there. And this was going to be the last meeting of the Big Three, but it's no longer the Big Three. Roosevelt died in April 1945, before the war ended. And so, we still have Stalin, but who's the American president?
Truman.
Harry Truman. Churchill arrived, but Britain had elections. Britain, for the first time since the war began, had a parliamentary election. No longer was it going to be this coalition government that existed during the war. And the Labour leader won. Clement Attlee came back after the election. Attlee, who was part of the wartime cabinet, knew what was going on much more than Truman knew. But this meeting, Stalin would dominate. He looked at Truman and Attlee as being weak non-entities. The way he looked at it, I dealt favorably at Yalta with two giants, FDR and Churchill. Who's Attlee? Who's Truman? And they met in Potsdam, July 1945. And this would be a very, very contentious meeting. You know, did I say Yalta? I meant Potsdam. Yalta, even though the things that were going to lead to the Cold War were already happening, it was still like we're won, everything's fine. Potsdam, things were significantly different. Why Potsdam? The Cold War had basically begun. And Truman wanted to go in there and look tough. Truman did not want to be bullied by Stalin, who was going to bully him. And Attlee, by then, Britain was very weak. And so, almost immediately, Stalin informed Truman and still Churchill, you know about those free elections? Not going to do it. And Truman and Attlee had no choice but to accept. And what are they going to do? Yeah, you're not going to attack the Red Army. They just beat the Nazis. No way. There's nothing they could do. And so almost immediately it seemed like a big victory for Stalin. And then the reparations. They told Stalin, no reparations, especially not from the Western zones. we're not going to scrounge for $20 billion here for you. So no reparations. Stalin was furious, absolutely furious. And one more thing happened at that. The baby was born. The atomic bomb. While the meeting was going on, the first atomic bomb was tested in New Mexico. That's the code that Truman got that the bomb worked. The baby was born. He was overjoyed. I mean, overjoyed. He could not wait to tell Stalin. Look what I have. Yeah, that's what Kennedy called the Minuteman during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The one that they built right over Helena. That's my ace in the hole. And so he went to Stalin and said, "We have a bomb. We believe it can destroy an entire city." And he wanted Stalin to go, "Wow, one bomb, one city." Now let's be clear. They had destroyed entire cities. In March of 1945, American B-29 bombers, 500 of them, firebombed Tokyo, destroyed half of it, and killed 120,000 people. They're already destroying full cities. More people died there than died because of the atomic bomb. But now one bomb, one city, he thought Stalin would be like, ah. And Stalin just popped up his pipe and said, "That is good. I will use it." Truman was so disappointed. He really was. Why was Stalin so nonchalant?
Because he knew about it.
Stalin had spies at Los Alamos where they constructed the bomb, and they already knew. In fact, the plans for that kind of bomb, which is the prototypical bomb, the implosion bomb, the bomb they dropped, the second atomic bomb dropped over Japan, Nagasaki was that style. The plans were already on the way to the Soviet Union, stolen by a Bulgarian physicist who was a communist, and he thought for sure that the U.S. would become fascist, and Stalin needs the bomb to protect the people. And so, with that, Potsdam would kind of devolve. There would come out of this the Potsdam Declaration. The Soviets were not involved in this because the Soviet Union had not declared war on Japan yet, but basically they told Japan, surrender, will blow you up. Which, of course, Japan looked at it as, you're already blowing us up. So, Japan was completely and militarily defeated. And part of the reason the United States was so happy at Potsdam is because they made the decision that now we can end the war, hopefully, continue bombing, but end the war with an atomic bomb before the Russians could get in. Does everyone got that? Japan was completely and totally militarily defeated by the summer of 1945. They were done. They could not fight any longer. But the Soviets were pledged to enter on August 8th. And now Truman's like, uh-oh. Are we going to have to give them an occupation zone in Japan? What are we going to do? It's no coincidence that the atomic bomb was dropped, the first one on August 6th. 2 days before the Soviets entered the war. To get it over. And so that's Potsdam. Those are the wartime problems. But on your list then, turn to the very last page, or not the last page, page 21 on that packet. I put down post-war disruption. And let's talk a little bit about the post-war disruption, because it's hard to describe what was going on there. We don't know how many people died in World War II. At least 60 million people died in Europe. Most times you see 55 to 60 total. No. It's probably another 20 million died in the Pacific, mostly in China. And so we're talking 80 million total. I mean, it's hard to even wrap our mind around that catastrophe. 25 million, at least 25 million were Soviets. Poland lost a third of their population. And not only that, 6 million Jews and 6 million other undesirables were killed by the Nazis. It's hard to wrap our mind around these numbers. When you think about this and put it in context, how many people live in Montana? About 1 million.
So us 80 times over?
Yeah. It's how many people live in the U.S. today?
350 million?
About 320.
322.
I mean, so we're talking a fourth of the population of the United States gone. It's incomprehensible what happened. The United States lost about 450,000, which is unbelievable, and it's a drop in the bucket compared to what happened in other places. And so after the war, it was a disaster area. And even though some of the economies got going relatively fast, there's going to be millions of, they call them DPs, displaced persons. DPs. In fact, it was a real insult in the 1950s. If people dressed kind of rough or kind of dirty going to school in the United States, they'd say, "What are you, a DP?" Which is really a horrible insult to mock these people who lost their homes because of the war. What a surreal time that had to be. There were millions. The Germans used millions of slave laborers, and when the war ended, they just kind of had to wander home. A lot of times when they got home, their home was gone or someone else had taken them. Hundreds of thousands of Jews that survived the death camps tried to go home, and a lot of places, they didn't want them. Like in Poland, no, we're not letting you in. Get out of here. I don't care. You didn't suffer any more than we did, was a pretty common refrain. This was a shocking time. And so you just imagine the whole world turned upside down. And then living in ruin every place you go. It's remarkable some places like Paris survived, but still, absolutely amazing. But one of the big areas of post-war disruption would be Eastern Europe. You know, we talked about this before, but remember there were the big empires, and so there's a hodgepodge of people. What happened after World War II?
Civil War.
In a way, for the next 3 years, it was civil war in the East. That was a big post-war disruption. They literally forced, like the Poles forced out all the Germans and Ukrainians who lived there. Forced them out at gunpoint. Thousands more would die. And the Poles took out the revenge of the German-speaking people there. Now, look at this map. All this area here used to be part of Germany. The Soviets gave it to Poland. It's mostly Germans. At gunpoint, they're sent east. All this area was Poland. The Soviets took it. At gunpoint, all the Poles moved here. And in all these other places where there are different groups of people, they were literally kicked out. Any Germanic-speaking people who lived here, all over the next year, at gunpoint, would be marched into Germany. So Germany is just going to be filled up with refugees. In fact, many of the old concentration camps would still be open. And these now refugees would live there because they have no place else to live. Dachau, the first concentration camp, they built right after Hitler did the Enabling Act. They would still have refugees as late as 1954. In reeking, horrific, they were basically, where they housed them were horse stables. That's what they housed them in. They used that design. And so that gives you an idea how awful it was. And one of the things that happened is after the war, in the United States, the assumption was, war is over, they can rebuild, we done, we conquered, let's go home. And here's the thing. In this post-war disruption where you have to get this, the biggest fear in Western Europe was, if we don't do something to alleviate the problems of starvation, unemployment, people without homes, what's going to happen?
Communism.
Either communism or fascism. This will, everyone got that? That's really important. That is directly going to lead to the creation of what we call today, and it was already started, we talked about this in Britain, the welfare state. Where they're going to make sure that every single person in Western Europe is going to have a minimum standard of living. You know, high employment, high wages, unemployment insurance, health care, free education. All these things, a lot of we don't have here. You know, limited work hours, that, you know, strong labor unions, that became very important, this welfare state. And so, let's talk about post-war Europe, the Cold War. The Cold War, that's the first thing on that list down there. Let's go through that pretty quickly. Actually, what would The Cold War kind of began with Yalta and Potsdam, and this has been an agreement between the difference between communism and capitalism for years. But in 1946, Winston Churchill gave a speech. Now, he's no longer prime minister. Gave a speech in Fulton College, Missouri. It's actually a little tiny college, maybe 1,500 students now. There's about 800 then. And he said, "What is descending over Eastern Europe?" An Iron Curtain. Oh, he stole that from somebody else, but the Iron Curtain, right there. And what happened was, after World War II, Stalin created what we call, get down, satellite nations. Now, we always say communist governments, but let's be very clear about it. They're Stalinist governments. They're totalitarian states. They did all the rhetoric about workers' rights and, you know, ultimate democracy, but these are Stalinist dictatorships all through there. Now you notice Yugoslavia is pink, or orange, not pink, light orange. Turn to the last page. Not the last page, is that right? No, turn to page 22. Find Yugoslavia and Tito. Tito was a leader of the partisans. Tito led a very successful fight against German, Italian, other forces that tried to occupy Yugoslavia after its capture. Tito was a communist. Tito liberated Yugoslavia before the Soviets got there. He did it on his own. So when the Soviets swept through here in the summer and fall of 1944, Tito was already retaking it. So Tito created his own communist totalitarian state. And in 1946, Tito and Stalin had a major fight. And Yugoslavia was never a satellite nation, never a close friend of the Soviet Union. Yes, Tito would establish a totalitarian state and rule the various countries of Yugoslavia with an iron fist, but they remained outside. When I was a kid, I remember talk like Tito, you know, Yugoslavia could be our friend because they don't trust the Soviets, even though they had a pretty nasty government. And Tito died in 1980. And when Tito died, his successors could not keep that all those groups of Slavic nations together. And in 1989, it blew up. Everyone got that? In 1989, it would blow up. That's why I wanted to get to Tito. We'll come back to Tito. So back to the Cold War. And so all the old fears of Soviets, of communism in the West brewed up, and more talk about Yalta here. And then something big happened. Remember the reparations? Well, as Stalin decided, if you're not going to give me the reparations, I'll take it. And so even though this was applied at Potsdam, the Soviets in this occupation zone right here took everything of value, put it on trains, and sent it back to the Soviet Union. Everything. Now remember, it's destroyed. Germany's a wasteland, but to the Soviets, in fact, they were really resentful. Soviet soldiers went into German houses and they weren't destroyed, and they saw things like running water and toilets that most Soviets didn't have. And the Soviets asked a good question: why would you attack us if you had all this? But that's what they took. They took the toilets, they took boards, they took rugs, they took couches, they took machinery, they took cars, they took everything, including the kitchen sink. They cut off squares of the Autobahn, put it on flatbeds, and took it back to the Soviet Union. Yeah, I have Autobahn. And the great part about it is they didn't know what to do with it, so they basically just threw it away. But they took it anyways. That was, they're going to be reparations. And this infuriated the Allies, who finally they cut off Lend-Lease aid. So that's one thing about the Cold War. 1946, Truman said, well, if you're taking it all, you won't get Lend-Lease. The U.S. promised to keep Lend-Lease going for a couple years. And when that happened, you could argue the Cold War began. The Cold War began there. And then the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine would be the United States policy for the Cold War. In fact, it became, everyone got the Truman Doctrine? The Truman Doctrine would be the basis of American foreign policy And therefore, because America was a dominant power, Western foreign policy, until when?
To this day.
To this very moment. The Truman Doctrine. And its main idea was that the Soviets were going to take over the world. It was Soviet idea to conquer the world, which, by the way, was not Stalin's idea. Stalin wanted to get as much as he could, but then be the leader of his own Soviet Union. Oh, don't get me wrong. If you gave him something, he would take it. But they pledged to take over the world. And so the United States, and therefore the West, must be willing to stop communism everywhere. That's where you get the term containment. Stop it everywhere. Stop communism everywhere. Containment. Why? Because if one country falls to communism, what will happen? The domino effect. Now we say the domino theory, but the domino effect. One country will fall, they all topple. And so, that became the basis of it. And there's one more very important thing about the Truman Doctrine. Truman was trying to get aid for a military dictatorship in Greece. And so he exaggerated the threat by saying the Soviets are taking over everything. But there's one very important thing to understand about this. In Truman theory thinking, communism is indivisible. And all led from the Kremlin.
So all communists are the same.
Every communist is the same. Indivisible means one communist is the same as another communist. And so that means a communist labor union in Italy, or I'm sorry, a syndicalist labor union in Italy, or guerrillas against the military dictatorship of Greece, or Mao Zedong in China, or the bunch of rabid communists in North Dakota, hotbed for communist activity. They have a state-owned bank. They're all communists, and everyone's being led by the Kremlin. Now that is simply not true, but that became the basis of American thinking. Now, Truman is thinking, in reality, we're going to stop communism by putting in better systems. A democratic republic with a kind of mixed form of capitalism is much better than a totalitarian communist state. That's what Truman believed. But I think you can see where this is going. Military. If we're going to stop communism, we'll stop it everywhere. And that's containment. Oh, and by the way, this became thinking all the way through, and when the Cold War ended, it still dominated foreign policy. And so now you just have to take out the word communism and you put in the word terrorism, and American foreign policy follows the same exact idea. Okay, so that's a very brief version of the Truman Doctrine. The Marshall Plan, though, 1948. The Marshall Plan, 1948. I'm just going right down the list now, quick. What was this? Marshall Plan, massive aid for Western Europe. The United States realized that Western Europe was destroyed, and they made the decision. Actually, Truman did an amazing job selling this to a Republican-controlled Congress who didn't want to do it. They would pledge $12 billion to rebuild Western Europe. But the important thing is, not just Western Europe, the occupation zones of Germany called West Germany, soon to be called West Germany. Now, Stalin was terrified that the Western Allies would rearm Germany and send them back. And this seemed to confirm his fears, because the money did not go to Stalin. Let me rephrase that. This is what the United States said. We'll give you aid if you agree to give up your Stalinist governments in Eastern Europe. Of course, they're never going to do that, so it only went to Western Europe. Marshall Plan was an incredibly successful. Not only did it help boom the American economy, but it would lead to what we call, this is what we have to get, the European miracle. The European miracle. An economic boom in Western Europe. Next, what to do in Germany then? In the Allied occupation zones, they began a program of denazification, and they had to root out members of the Nazi Party. And at first, they were going to ban all members of the Nazi Party. They could never hold government positions, and they would try high-ranking ones for war crimes. And there would be a war crimes trial. Where would the war crimes trial be? Nuremberg. The first time in history. The Nuremberg trials. A tribunal where you had a British, American, and British judge would lay judgment on high-ranking Nazis.
British American Soviet.
What did I say?
British American British.
You got a problem with that? A British American and Soviet judge. And these trials went on. So the most high-ranking one was a very big trial, and then they kept doing it for lower-ranking ones. But then there was a problem. When the war was over, everybody just kind of wanted it to be over. And as it went on, more and more high-ranking Nazis would be, for example, Jochen Peiper, who was his command, executed 129 American soldiers at Malmedy during the Battle of the Bulge, his 1st SS Panzer Division. And he was sentenced to death. Then he was commuted to life. And then he served 5 years. He just wanted it over. He would die in France.
Yeah, I just couldn't get out of France, I guess.
Yeah, he was just a devout Nazi. And so pretty soon it was like, let's just get this thing over. And so at first it was big tough. We're going to crack down on Nazis and collaborators. But pretty soon it was pretty soft. And there was another problem. If you're going to get a government job in Nazi Germany, what did you have to be?
Nazi.
Yeah. So all teachers were Nazis. Everyone who knew how to work, for example, the electrical facilities were Nazis. Because they had to join the party. If you fire them, what happens?
The entire country shut down.
So they couldn't do it. So it was very selective. By the way, we should have experience with this. The U.S. did this in Iraq. They fired all of the Baathists who were Saddam Hussein's party, and the whole thing just fell apart. It would help contribute to the Civil War in 2006. Reparations. I already talked about reparations. So go down to the Berlin Blockade. The Berlin Blockade. Here's the deal with the Berlin Blockade. Remember, Berlin, the Western occupation zones are in the middle of the Russian occupation zone. And what happened was, you notice down below I have FRG. That's the Federal Republic of Germany. West Germany. The Allies decided, if we're never going to come together and unify this, we need to create a West German currency. In West Germany, the Allies created the Deutschmark, a currency. So they could actually start rebuilding the economy of West Germany. They were using occupation script, and they had all kinds of weird, hackneyed ways. So there's dollars, pounds, francs, British occupation script, just money they printed for themselves, American, French, old money. It was just a chaos. They need their own currency. But if you have your own currency, you need something else. Markets do not function without government. So they had to create a separate government. So by saying we're announcing the creation of mark, Stalin realized they're going to make a West Germany. He was furious. They're going to arm them and send them back again. So what did Stalin do? Up to the Berlin Blockade. He cut off the land routes into the Allied occupation zones of West Berlin. They allowed for the air routes. Basically what he was saying is this. You want West Berlin? Give up West Germany. There's your choice. No mark. You can have no Deutschmarks. We're going to still unify this. Stalin still held hopes that he created Germany under his control.
What's the story? That doesn't exist.
For 10 months, the Western Allies flew in supplies into Berlin and broke the blockade. It was an humiliating defeat for Stalin. Yet in the West, it seemed like he's trying to take West Berlin. And so, in response, formally, during the blockade, the three powers created West Germany officially. And where did they put the capital? Bonn. In Bonn. Why Bonn? There was nothing in Bonn. Bonn was a little tiny city just south of Cologne. Konrad Adenauer, who would be the first premier of West Germany, was from there. But why Bonn?
East Germany?
They always figured if we unify, we want to go back to Berlin as the capital. So let's put it in a small city that won't have a lot of clout. If we put it in Hamburg, big, huge industrial city, Hamburg won't let it go. So if you go to Bonn today, it's weird. Because you have all these big, huge government buildings, massive buildings, because it was the capital of a rich country. Mostly empty. It's kind of going into a much nicer and better kept butte. Okay, so in response, the Soviets created East Germany. And violating the four-power agreement, where did East Germany create their capital?
Berlin.
East Berlin. That's the German Democratic Republic. And East Germany would become one of the most repressive Stalinist states. Their secret police, the Stasi, kept track of everybody's lives. There's a great movie called The Life of Others. I put it on that list about the secret police. It is fantastic. I put it on that list for extra credit movies. I don't think anyone did. Perhaps it wasn't on Netflix. God, is that a good movie. I would love to show it to you after the test. We try to do it. Sophomores, we can't. I know, and you're like just about ready to be a junior. I know some teachers might do it anyways. No comment about that, but I can. But I really wish I could. It's a great movie. I wish I could get a. And there's like one scene. You know how that is. No, you don't. You're too young. Okay. Next. Also, the United States and the West created a military alliance in the West called. And what does NATO stand for?
North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I know. You think national? You guys, whenever there's a name, you always think national. North Atlantic. And originally, the North Atlantic, so that would be U.S. and Canada would be part of it, but Western Europe. And in 1955, guess who they let in? West Germany. And they allowed West Germany to rebuild their army in 1955. Isn't this ironic now? They would build a powerful army.
They have the most troops in NATO right now, don't they?
Mm-hmm. What was that to U.S.? Yeah, they still have a big army. They just got rid of the draft 2 years ago. And everybody outside of West Berlin was drafted. That was a way to keep young men in West Berlin that didn't have to be drafted. And the Soviets would finally respond in 1955 with
The
Warsaw Pact, which is my favorite name. It implies somehow that this is all of Eastern Europe coming together, like it's in Warsaw, so it couldn't be done by the Soviets. No, it's a Soviet military alliance. And the Warsaw Pact always had more men, and in raw numbers, more equipment. But by the 1960s, NATO had better equipment, and in reality, the size was relatively close. It was stalemate. And nobody was going to be crazy enough to go to war, even though for most of my life, or for most of my early life, this was always considered to be a potential battlefield. The vision of Warsaw Pact, tanks coming right there. When I was a kid, they always talked about that. And I know what you're thinking. That's in the 19-teens of the 20th century. Yeah.
Foresight, man.
Amazing. And so what came out of this was the beginnings of the arms race. And that's where we get the military-industrial complex on the next page. And the military-industrial complex was this. Once the arms race came, this would be... Rebecca, do you have that? Do you have your list down? Do you have any of this stuff?
No, I don't have the list. I got it, but I'm writing everything.
Okay, good. The military-industrial complex, a coalition of generals, industrial leaders, and politicians. So the military, industry, and politicians in a cabal to exaggerate the threat of the Soviets so they could do what?
Do it, make profit.
Yeah. The companies can make money. What happens to the military?
More power.
They get bigger, more generals. And what happens to politicians? They get money from industrialists to push the Cold War. And so, once again, an arms race would pick up again. And I have to be honest about it, it's amazing we're here. Now some of you, Wednesday afternoon next week, might be thinking, too bad, but no, I'm glad we're here. Because once you build an arms race, and a couple times it almost happened, Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and then in 1983, the Soviets were convinced the West was going to attack, and they were within hours of launching a full-out missile strike. No one knew in the West. I'm really glad I didn't know that.
And then Reagan calmed down.
That would have been scary. Okay, Comecon. Comecon would be an economic association. Everyone got that, Comecon? An economic association of communist states. This was supposed to match the growing interdependence of the West. The Soviets were trying to connect the communist countries in kind of a trade organization. And so like one country would build this, another country would build something else, so they would all do what they're best at. It was an economic disaster. It didn't work. It was more than anything else propaganda, and by the 1970s it was a joke. And the Eastern economies were in shambles. Next, let's skip down to Nikita Khrushchev. In 1953, a shocking thing happened. Stalin died. Stalin died. And for hours, for 18 hours, his cronies, including Nikita Khrushchev, were afraid to call for doctors because they were convinced it might be a trick by Stalin, because he had a stroke. And he was writhing on the ground. And they're like, he might be trying to see who's going to be the first one to try to take power and have us killed. That's how scared they were of Stalin. And when he died, they had a state funeral, and they did to Stalin's body what they did to Lenin's, which was what?
Make a
Glass.
They perfectly preserved Lenin's body, and it's still on display in the Kremlin today. It's still the biggest tourist attraction in Moscow. It's Lenin's body. In fact, during the Soviet Union, it was a big deal to go get married in front of Lenin's. That's what Stalin made Lenin's body. I'm not making that up. Because they were secular, there's no churches, technically, so you go get married. People still do get married in front of Lenin's body. So they perfectly preserved Stalin, but they kind of messed it up a little bit. And so like Lenin looks like he can just pop up and say hi, which is creepy. Stalin's kind of green. And they had them both lying in state. And there was a power struggle for a year and a half. And Nikita Khrushchev, who was one of the heroes of Stalingrad, took power. He was a crude Ukrainian who took power. In fact, it was because of him, because he's a Ukrainian, that even though Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, he gave the Crimea to the Ukrainian, to Ukraine. Even though most of the people living there are Russians. This directly relates to what's going on right now. Because Crimea now is back part of Russia. But Khrushchev, you probably have to know the Crimean part. I just found that fascinating how these things come back together. Khrushchev realized something very important. The Soviet Union, their economy is weak. The population does not have goods they need. They're still rebuilding after the war, and it's very haphazard. And Khrushchev realized the only way for the Soviet Union to survive is to try to alleviate the Cold War. He had to figure out ways to cut back on defense spending. Because the Soviets were spending so much on defense that there was little money for everybody else. Now in the West, they're spending a lot of money too, but the Western economies were significantly bigger. And so Khrushchev, the first thing he had to do was in 1957, in a secret meeting of the Politburo, he denounced Stalin, and that's de-Stalinization. The Soviets, Khrushchev denounced him and said Stalin was a villain. He was destructive, and we must get rid of him. And so they went through, over the years, over the next 3 years, there were hundreds of thousands, I'm not exaggerating, statues of Stalin. Everywhere you look, there was a statue of Stalin. And what happened?
Noses?
Yeah, a lot of broken noses. Why? When you push it down, yeah, what's the first thing to hit? Their nose. That's what happens. That's
Face.
yeah. Whenever you see whenever you see a statue without a nose, that's what happened. It was pushed down sometime. Well, Renaissance statues that were anatomically correct, they cut those off and put fig leaves over them during the Victorian era. That just cracks me up. Why would you destroy a great Victorian statue? Well, okay, somebody might see it. All right, so it's hard to find a statue of Stalin anywhere. When I was in Budapest, they had one of the few statues remaining with a broken nose, but his head's still there. But they did more than doing that. They kind of began to tone down the totalitarian rule, but in reality, they couldn't do it. Because anytime you try to tone down the totalitarian rule, what happened?
Unrest.
Unrest. People say, okay, now I want rights. No! For example, during de-Stalinization, one of the first things that happened was, it happened in Poland too, but in Hungary, Hungary had one of the most repressive Stalinist regimes. And in 1956, Khrushchev allowed them to put in a reformer. His name was Emir Nagy. He's one of the heroes of Hungary today, Emir Nagy. And what did Emir Nagy do when he came into power? He began to talk about making this into a more democratic socialist state. And Khrushchev is worried Poland might follow. In Berlin, there was already a riot, protest by workers in 1953 about the socialist paradise that really wasn't happening there. And they were brutally put down. They were really worried this might spread. So Khrushchev felt he had no choice but then to do what? Attack. And the Warsaw Pact attacked Hungary. It wasn't just Soviet troops. He made sure that there was Polish, Czech, Romanian, and Bulgarian troops too. Now, what made the Hungarian thing such a tragedy is that the United States, in the West, they were broadcasting propaganda to Hungary saying, if you do break away, we will come to your aid. So when the Soviets attacked, what did the West do?
Nothing.
They weren't really, that was talk. They weren't willing to blow the world up for Hungary. They still are resentful about that. They really are. And it was brutally put down. Thousands would be killed. And so a lot of Nikita Khrushchev's so-called reforms wouldn't happen. And in 1959, they even took Stalin's body. And in the middle of the night, Kremlin guards took Stalin's body out. They dug a 20-foot deep hole. And the plan was to put Stalin's body in there, then cover it all the way to the top with cement to make sure no one could dig that body out again and use it again. Or
You come back.
right?
Ghost of Stalin.
And so they put the body in, but in the kind of weird glow, they had torches. That body, even though it was a little bit green tint, the men were like, oh my God, he's still alive. And they were so scared they just kind of pushed whatever dirt they could over it. And so there's not cement. There's just a paved road, and that's it over Stalin's body. So right now, if you put your ear to the ground.
Scratch.
Okay, so.
Just one day. That's a ghost story for Russia right now.
And so Khrushchev, that's what you tell your kids where you go to bed. You better go to bed or Stalin will get you. Actually, to this day, Stalin is by far the most popular leader the Russians ever had. They still rate him as the most popular. The man who killed millions. Why? Because when Stalin was there, we were Russians. That's an important thing, All right, so de-Stalinization did not work, even though Khrushchev did have it did not work the way they'd hoped. One big achievement, what did they launch in 1957? Sputnik. The first satellite was actually launched by the Soviets. And this gave them a little bit of an advantage, but in reality, the West was way ahead. And there's another big problem. See the Berlin Wall? What was happening by the By the late 1950s, people were leaving East Berlin and going to the West and not coming back. People from Czechoslovakia were going to East Berlin, because East Berlin was they rebuilt East Berlin to make kind of a garden spot within the socialist empire. And people were going there and leaving and not coming back from the West. They called it the brain drain. All these people were leaving and not coming back. Khrushchev was furious about it. And when the West would not do anything about it, in 1961, as an act of desperation, what did the East Germans build, but of course with Khrushchev's approval? The Berlin Wall, violating the agreement. A wall that separated East and West Berlin eventually go around the entire city of West Berlin. And so it really did become an island of democracy within this totalitarian East Germany. And so, to this day, Berlin really does feel like an island. You feel like you're not part of the rest of Germany. To this day, has that feeling. And it's also noticeable, too, even though the wall is basically gone, you cross over into where the East was, and it also feels different, even though the rebuilding is kind of gray. There's trolleys. It's weird. Yeah, there's no trolleys in the West. There's trolleys in the East. They're nice, but it's just different. It's grungier, smaller. Oh, the other thing is that the toilets are smaller. Okay, so Solzhenitsyn was the most famous Soviet dissident during the Khrushchev era. He was an author, and he was actually pretty right-wing. He's kind of a neo-fascist almost. But he would write a book in 1963 called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich.
Oh. It's an awful book.
Well, it's really hard to read. I don't like it either.
It's so boring.
But what we need to know about Solzhenitsyn is he wrote a story about life in the Gulag. And this would become an international bestseller because it was smuggled out of Russia. And he became the most famous dissident, an example of people speaking out against a totalitarian state. He would eventually be exiled in 1974. He'd come to America and say, "You guys are decrepit and horrible and immoral." Solzhenitsyn was the kind of person who hated everybody. I don't think he could have been anywhere. He'd hate them. Interesting guy.
You should move to Paris.
Move to Bulgaria.
1968.
At that age.
You don't have to know the whole name. Just, all you need to know is it was a book about the life of the Gulag. He's the most famous dissident. Next, you want another one? Prague Spring. In 1968, similar to Hungary, Prague did their same thing under a man by the name of Dubček. Prague tried to create a liberal democracy. And the Soviets put it down with a vengeance in 1968. Destroyed it. And to this day, if you go to Prague, their capital, this big, huge building, and in it it's granite stones, and there are spots where they're different colored granite. When the Czechs rebuilt it, they used different colored granite to show the places where Soviet tanks fired into their capital, so you could always see where that happened. I think that's a great idea. You say they never forget what happened. And once again, the United States could do nothing. And so, while this is going on, let's skip down to détente. Détente. You see détente near the bottom? Mm-hmm. Ironically, beginning in 1969 to 1979, détente was a period of peace, a lessening of tensions between East and West. A lessening of tensions, where they began to open up the borders. There's actually a little bit of communication. The Berlin Wall actually helped ease tensions because it stopped that brain drain. So it kind of set the stage eventually for this. And there were a couple big agreements to limit the number of nuclear weapons, and tensions were eased for about a decade. The most important part about this, something that was discredited by rabid anti-communists, was in 1975, the Helsinki Agreements. The Helsinki Agreements. And it was a twofold agreement. The first part is the West, so the United States, well, NATO countries. They accepted the governments in East Europe. So they accepted those communist governments. But why the Helsinki Accords were important is that the Soviets pledged that we guarantee human rights. We guarantee human rights. Well, actually, everybody signed a guarantee where they pledge human rights. Now, of course, totalitarian states don't accept human rights. And a lot of people said, well, how dare you let the Soviets scam you? It's like Yalta all over. This would become an important symbolic idea because 12 years later, the Helsinki Accords we brought back. And with a new kind of government in the Soviet Union, they would say, remember the Helsinki Accords, you pledged human rights? And 12 years later, the new government of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, said, yes, I agree. And this would become the basis of the breakup of the Soviet Union. It just would take 14 years.
Yeah, and then they hate him.
Yeah, they still hate him. Okay.
The best leader, Gorbachev.
But in 1979, Dachau ended. The Cold War heated up, tensions grew, the arms race exploded, more nuclear weapons than ever were built before, and it was personified by an absolutely desperate effort by the Soviets. They invaded Afghanistan in 1979. Fearful of the spread of Islamic revolution that started in Iran, this was so stupid on the Soviets' part, they tried to prop up their old puppet government, and this turned into a horrific civil war. Guess how long this civil war has gone on? Until at that time right now, it's still going on. And the United States and the West backed the guerrillas. Yeah.
Aren't they like with the guerrillas and the Taliban, I guess?
Oh yeah. Including men like Osama bin Laden. And we've said, those godless communists are going to take away Islam. Yeah, there'll be a problem there later on. And this would begin the slow degeneration of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was already in a very fast decline, but Afghanistan would turn into just this black hole. And they would end up losing about 40,000 men. And then in 1986, as the Soviet economy, in reality, even though the West did not realize it, was in free fall, they had the worst nuclear accident in history, Chernobyl. And Chernobyl was huge. They had, in essence, a minor meltdown. The reactors overheated. It released...
Minor meltdown?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't a full meltdown. They literally had helicopters dump sand onto an open reactor, and every single person who did that has now died within a year. They had men on the roof with nothing more than a gas mask on the roof, trying to put cement on it. They all died. And Chernobyl was a disaster. It's still a 200-mile radius around where the factory was or the nuclear reactor was in the Ukraine. It's a dead zone. And this convinced the new leader of the Soviet Union, if you look above, Mikhail Gorbachev, who replaced a series of hardliners. Mikhail Gorbachev, that we got to do something in this Cold War. Now, if a minor accident like at Chernobyl, and it's relatively minor, I know it's huge, but compared to nuclear war, this accident killed thousands and disrupted millions of people, what will nuclear war be? It is folly. And so he began intense negotiations. But part of the reason is Gorbachev realized, like Khrushchev, if we don't end the arms race, we're doomed. And he also made two other big decisions, Glasnost and Perestroika. See those on the list, Glasnost and Perestroika? Glasnost, they opened up the media. They opened up free speech. Remember that was one of the big liberal reforms going back to the Romantic or the nationalist era? You need freedom of the press before you can have liberal states. I wonder what that's like. That would have been cool. And Perestroika. Perestroika was opening up the economy. They began to open up the state. And one of the most important things they did is he announced that the Brezhnev Doctrine, Brezhnev was the guy who replaced Khrushchev. The Brezhnev Doctrine said that the Soviets would intervene wherever they wanted in socialist states, meaning Czechoslovakia. They could intervene wherever they want in socialist states. That was justification for Afghanistan. Kind of like the Truman Doctrine. Gorbachev said the Brezhnev Doctrine, doesn't apply. Doesn't apply. We're not going to do that anymore. Why is this a big deal?
Now they can't do the domino effect because they won't invade anymore.
Partially, yeah.
They can't stop the revolts.
Beginning in 1988 and going into 1989, one by one, the satellite nations begin to break away. One by one. At first, just relatively minor, open up their government a little bit, open it up a little bit, then step by step, they broke away. And Gorbachev did not stop it. And once he ended the totalitarian state and opened up free speech, what happened in the Soviet Union? Yeah, exactly. Why don't we have these rights? And the whole thing fell apart. Once you got rid of it. And so, a couple things we'll get down to. First off, look down to Solidarity and Lech Wałęsa. Lech Wałęsa was a leader of a labor union in Poland called Solidarity. And even though they talk a good deal about workers' rights, of course totalitarian states don't want labor unions. And in 1980, this would trigger an uprising in Poland. So everyone got that? Poland, Solidarity, Lech Wałęsa. This became big news. And in 1980, the Soviets put it down brutally. In 1989, Solidarity reemerged. Lech Wałęsa was let out of prison. And they demanded free elections. And what happened in 89? They got it. They got it. And Poland broke away. Lech Wałęsa is one of the bravest men I've ever heard of. You know, he knew exactly what he's doing. He never went out of the limelight. I just remember the news. I remember when tanks went into the port of, now it's called Gdansk, it was Danzig before World War II, to put down Solidarity. They're mostly ship workers. God, this was, I mean, it looked like it might be World War III. It was unbelievable. And now they had won. And there's one person we must mention. 1979, Pope John Paul I died only after a month. And a new pope, John Paul II. And John Paul II was a pope, rabidly anti-communist. And through the Catholic Church in Poland, they had no church. They could not remove the Catholic Church from Poland. This helped Solidarity. And John Paul would become a symbol of ending the Cold War, and that's why he has just been sainted for his work here. You go to Krakow, Poland, that's where he's from, and John Paul II is.
Everywhere?
Everywhere. Okay, look down the next one. Václav Havel, who was a screenwriter, a playwright, I'm sorry. 1989, he would become a leader of what's called the Velvet Revolution. Where? Prague, in Czechoslovakia. The Velvet Revolution. Like, almost followed the same lines as '68, but this time they won. Czechoslovakia broke away, and then, okay, he didn't want this, but Havel had to allow for this to break up. Slovakia did not want to be part of Czechoslovakia anymore, and so now you have the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And so, go up to the Commonwealth of Independent States. 1991, the Soviet Union is now alone. They're breaking up. And in 1991, there was an attempted coup by Gorbachev, against Gorbachev. Hardliners were going to try to reestablish the Soviet Union. It failed miserably, partially because the actions of the drunken president of Russia. Yes, he was a drunk. Oh my goodness, was he a drunk? I suppose he drank like 3 liters of vodka a day.
Is this the guy who's in Doctor Strange?
No.
Does he even have a liver anymore?
No, he's dead.
Are you sure?
But he's well preserved. His name was Boris Yeltsin. And Boris Yeltsin stood up to the coup. The army did not follow him, and the coup was destroyed. But what came out of this too? So was the Soviet Union. It dissolved into 16 independent countries. And Boris Yeltsin became the first president of an independent Russia. Yeah.
So he stood up against the coup?
Against the coup.
Oh.
And even though Gorbachev was released, and he was still technically premier of the Soviet Union, he didn't have a country anymore. It broke up. Still weird. He remained the president of the Soviet Union for like 3 more months because they didn't know what else to do. But almost immediately then, when Russia broke up, ethnic groups inside Russia wanted to be independent. And the most prominent would be the Chechens. And in 1993 till 1997, a horrific civil war where the Russians put down the Chechens and killed hundreds of thousands. To this day, it is still a very volatile place. There are still Chechen guerrillas. And part of the reason what makes the Chechens unique from the rest of the Russians is they're Muslim. And so they have become very radicalized. And that was one of the great fears during the Olympics, the Winter Olympics. The Chechen guerrillas would attack. That was a real big fear. Do you kind of remember that about terrorist attack? It was Chechens.
I see the black photos are.
Mm-hmm. They're Chechens. Okay. Let's go through a couple more, then I'll finish the rest. You want to go through a couple more? Yeah. Run through a lot, don't I? Okay, turn the page back over, and let's go to a few more things on that page, and I'll quit, and I'll show you a program. Sound good? Find Fourth Republic in De Gaulle. France created a Fourth Republic. Remember, we've had the first, well, we had the first and second during the Revolution. Or, I'm sorry, the first was during the French Revolution. The second was in 1848, lasted like 3 days. The third was after the Franco-Prussian War. That ended in World War II. But the fourth was always very unstable. The Fourth Republic was unstable, especially because France tried to keep their colonies. Specifically 2 colonies, and it would turn out to be a disaster. One of these colonies, most of you should know. Syria. Syria, they had to just give up. What?
Vietnam.
Well, it wasn't called Vietnam then.
French Indochina.
French Indochina. And they tried to keep their colony in French Indochina with huge American aid because of communism. And the French were defeated in 1954, and they pulled out. But the one that destroyed the Fourth Republic was Algeria. The French tried to keep Algeria. And in one of the most bloody and just, it's hell on earth, for 9 years, this violent war against Algerian rebels who wanted independence took place. And assassinations, terrorist acts on both sides, horrific tortures on both sides. And in 1958, Algeria destroyed the French government. The military threatened a coup. It looked like military dictatorship. And who stepped back in? The leader of the Free French, who helped establish the Fourth Republic and then resigned, came back. Charles de Gaulle, using his iron force of will, created the French Fifth Republic. They're still in the Fifth Republic. And by the way, because of this, today in France, France is this very open, wealthy, beautiful country. Everybody is shockingly nice in France, except Paris. Paris, the Parisians are kind of mean to everybody. Outside of France, they hate Parisians too. It's pretty funny. New York City is a little like that too. We are the greatest, and everyone else is inferior. And so people say French are mean. No, just inside Paris, they're mean to everybody. Outside of that, God, they're nice. Unless you're from Belgium, then they make fun of you. But, and in the Fifth Republic, de Gaulle, using his force of will, just said, we got to give up Algeria. We got to give up these things. And they basically lost their empire, but France was saved, and they even dropped out of NATO. Because he wanted to make France unified and independent, exploded an atomic bomb. France became a more of an individual power, and there's free because of de Gaulle had to do that to keep the thing together. But in France today, you don't have rights. If you're arrested, whew, goodbye.
So don't get arrested.
This idea that we have about rights that really come from Britain, France, you don't have them. It's actually really weird because it's such an open, free country in so many ways. And by the way, it's really funny. In the Netherlands, you have more those rights and more. So it's just kind of weird. They're right next to each other. In the Netherlands, technically, they can't search you with a warrant.
What? Well, sounds like a problem. I have a warrant. Okay.
Next. Okay, West Germany. We already talked about the growth of West Germany, but Konrad Adenauer would be the first president of it, and Adenauer was a hero because he was an anti-Nazi. He fought against them, was in a concentration camp. And so Adenauer would be that first leader, and they would begin the the economic miracle. The economic miracle of Germany, rebuilding its economy, and they were very lucky. Factories near Hamburg and Dusseldorf that were going to make cars, Nazi cars for everybody. The machine tools survived. And so right after the war, they didn't have to rebuild it all. They could start making these cars that were approved by Hitler. What cars am I talking about?
Volkswagen.
The Beetle, yeah. The Beetles, that was the people's car, that's Volkswagen, people's car. And Hitler personally approved it, and they could start selling these. And even though they didn't sell a lot, they became kind of like almost like a counterculture car. Like you were hip and cool in the U.S. if you had a Beetle.
Or you were a Nazi.
Or you were.
Yeah, they didn't bother to tell you that part. And by the way, those are really dangerous cars. Why? The engine's in back.
Back. Get rear-ended.
No, not only that. If you hit something,
It's coming through.
yeah, the bumper's now part of you, like an accordion. So if you see an the Pinto's just exploded. I know, where's Cody to defend his Pinto? Okay, next. Great Britain under Clement Attlee would have their own economic miracle, but not as much. They created the welfare state under Clement Attlee. They finished it off. Remember, they already had Social Security and pension, but they finished off the welfare state. And under Attlee, and for the next 30 years, they nationalized most of the big business. Nationalized means what?
The government.
The government took it over. And actually, some of it worked really well, some of it didn't. The railroads worked really well under nationalism. The car companies did not work as well, because one of the problems with government rule is it's not as flexible for the changing market. And so that would be a problem. But they nationalized it, and then the big thing that they did is they did National Health Service, the NHS. Socialized medicine. The British government took over the healthcare system for good reason. This is the way the British looked at it, and the way the people looked at it. We have fought and sacrificed in World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. No way are we going to go back to where we're going to be poor and only a tiny few are rich. So we demand a piece of the pie, a better life. And the National Health Service was one of the biggest ones. Every single person in Britain has health care. It's paid for through taxes. All you have to do is apply, and you do that through, they have Social Security there too. Your Social Security card, and you're now a member, and you just go, and if you're sick, you go to the hospital. If you need to go to the dentist, you just go.
I don't agree with the dentist one. I don't think they do that.
Huh?
Yeah,
They definitely don't.
Actually, this might shock you, but today, I know they make fun of the British. There's a big deal to make fun of British teeth, but now their dental care is significantly better than the average Americans. Makes sense. Which is really bad, because Britain, no, they're supposed to have bad teeth. That's part of the joke. And they began massive redistribution of wealth. High taxes for the very wealthy, and made sure that to lessen the gap between the rich and the poor. All the rest of Europe did that too. Britain would do that to the 1980s, much like the U.S.
What happened to their government now?
Margaret Thatcher.
That's what happened.
I'm pointing at something. Why am I doing this? I was going to write something down.
The EEC.
Okay, so moving on. It'll come to me in a second. Hey, one day you two will be old and or befuddled.
I'm already befuddled.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, lastly, let's do the European Economic Community, the EEEC.
That was one too many.
Yeah, you just said 3 E's.
The EEEC. And this goes back to, remember Napoleon did the continental system? This kind of goes back to this idea of one Europe as a free trade zone. Napoleon tried this, failed. The Hanseatic League kind of did this back in the 15th century. How's that for bringing the very beginning into this, huh?
That's what you get for bringing the beginning.
Nope, no Hanseatic League.
And so, with this, I forgot to push don't ring. Oh, that's Breaker Moran.
Let's watch it again. That was a good movie.
Yeah, wasn't that great? Okay, so it started with France. It's called the Samson Plan. And the French foreign minister came up with an idea to economically unify Europe. And at first it was called the Council of Europe. But then eventually they would create the European Coal and Steel not steel. The European Coal and Steel Community. 6 countries were part of this. You can probably guess which 6, can't you? France,
Germany,
Luxembourg, Belgium,
Netherlands?
the Netherlands, Italy, and West Germany. And what they did is they got rid of tariff barriers. They opened up the borders. And this big 6 would eventually lead to, in 1957, the European Economic Community that would eventually encompass all of Europe, a free trade zone by the Treaty of Rome. The European Economic Committee was a free trade zone. And then after that, in 1992, they expanded it completely to a European Union, where they got rid of tariff barriers and even agreed to their own common currency, which has actually turned out to be a disaster. What is it called?
Euro.
The euro. And in 2001, they went to it. Okay, let me show you something very quick on my webpage. Now, I am not exactly sure where we're going to meet. We might meet here. I will let you know, or we might meet in Tech 2. But we're going to do a practice test. And so, everybody's going to go to my webpage. And they're going to hit, I'll actually put a link up here for AP European Review. AP European Review. Okay, I'll put a link. You click that link, and this is what you have to do. Everybody, you have to do this. Oops. I must have been saving something. You hit AP Review, and you're going to download a program. All right? You're going to download it.
It's full of viruses.
Yes, it is full of thousands of viruses. And, wait. Open it, and then what you got to do is this. Could you wait a second? We're still in the middle of something. Get out of here. I know you're anxious to go to study hall. Okay, that really irritates me.
Continue.
Huh? I will be very mad at him. Okay, make sure you save this into your file. And then what you do is you double click it. Oh, I'm sorry. What you do is right click, and then you have to do Why isn't this opening? It's not working. You right-click, open, and then extract all. Make sure you save it in your file. And when it's extract, I have good news for all of you. I will have to go back because something happened with this. I will do this and get to finish it up tomorrow, okay? Boy, that made me mad. You're in the middle of something and they just walk in?
That's what I was like chemistry of it every single day. I walked it. Girlfriend is really weird.
Okay, everybody!
What are all these people
If you're for AP American History and you have your DBQ, there's a stapler. Staple the document.
Oh.
Staple your, oh, you got them?
Is that the bottom?
Yeah.
There's no way that's the bottom.
It's Vietnam.
Vietnam? We didn't do that DBQ last year.
No, we didn't do that one.
Unfortunately, this is not. Is this one of those review sessions?
Yeah, we're doing a review session.
Are we having one tonight?
Yeah, we're having one tonight. They just, I got to do a few lunches, so we're not that much.
I would totally say
DGQ is on the bottom.
Brainstorm.
Brainstorm.
Yeah, outline essay, the document.
Use scissors, because like, I can't get these.
Just don't worry about it.
You want it or you want it in pot?
Yeah, go ahead. In fact, yeah, just give it to me.
Do you want the document?
Yeah, put them all together.
Boom. Come on.
Sorry.
There's a stapler right there.
Just better write my name on it first.
And then, like I said, I would review. I would go over anything. I'll go over some things that, especially from the last couple pages.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Is there a place to put them, or did we just get
Yeah, just give them to me.
All right, sweet.
So I think I have fourth period. So
Pride and joy. Better grade that nice.
how'd you do?
Incredible. I'd say at least a 95.
No, seriously, you think you did well?
Yeah.
Awesome, great.
Sorry.
No, I did.
Really bad. No, I did good. I did good. I don't think I did.
I'm sure you did.
Big city, you have your hand ready.
Anybody have a spoon?
Yes.
Dude, I had so much.
Just like we're
Pizza.
Go. That's, no, that's the pro.
Come on.
I got really.
Did you get
We're in AP Euro, and I'm trying to show them this review program. I'll show you guys tomorrow.
You remember we did for AP
I
Euro?
did, so I was just gonna wear a white dress.
Yeah.
I don't
We
know
had the
if I
AP
should wear
American
like blue shirt with a white tie.
AP Euro won't really hard. Even though I think it was good.
I'm doing that. Like a
Like page.
kind of like that color blue.
Nine-ish.
And then silver tie.
And the bell rang. I'll just finish telling this kid just walked
That's
in.
not the color Bailey's dress.
Just walk in.
Yeah, yeah. We have study all second period.
Her shirt. She's wearing it. She's ignoring it.
No, it's kind of like your
Okay, if you have a DBQ, give it to me.
Why don't you do that a little more?
We just work backwards.
What's that?
We just work backwards.
Yeah, start from the 2000s.
Yeah, I'm not going to start in 2000. I'm going to start in 1980.
Okay.
I'll start in 1980. I'll just go through a bunch right now.
Okay.
Just give us all the answers to the AP test.
Yeah, because
Would you like the
So, did you
document
see
stapled?
Yeah, on the bottom. Stapler's right over there.
The kids are gonna take AP test.
And the thing about it is, I'm going to go over some of these things, but I'm not going to go over them. I'm not going to go over in depth in class.
yeah, gotcha. Yeah, capital.
You don't do that.
Yeah.
Anybody with a DBQ?
Woo!
At 6 bells.
Someone's probably lost
The
it.
door here. Like,
I don't know you.
And remember, I will do a full review section. I'll give it, and I'm going to give you a gift. I have a gift for you.
What? What is it?
There's nobody here. I was expecting more.
Yeah, so was
Me
I.
too.
Well, I will yell at them if they're not here. I take great offense.
By name right now, just
Well, when they come, when I see them
That's a lot.
tomorrow.
That is a
And if
huge
people don't come at
line.
night,
That is.
I get really mad. If people don't come, I mean, I'll make it clear, heck, if you don't. If I don't get over half, I won't do it again. I won't do another review session.
No, you'll get more than that.
If I don't get, and actually, I want a lot more than half. I won't do another one. There won't be any noon, there won't be Sunday, I just won't do them. You guys don't want it, won't do it.
Yeah, we definitely appreciate this.
What if I have to leave? I have to leave early on Wednesdays, like 6:45.
Well, I know, if you have to leave early, I understand that. I mean, everyone's got, there's gonna be conflict. I understand that, but if people just don't show up, I get really mad.
Very self-driven.
Yeah, dude, you're a little
I'm going to
hungry.
eat fast so I can write.
Dude,
You know, do
even
it
your
more
hands,
than
yeah.
together.
There's a reason. Like the Taco Bell commercial, bro.
We're doing we have a few kids coming for review, but not very many, so.
What are you reviewing?
It's the 1980s. For AP.
I'm reviewing everything.
White or black?
So I just found out something about the 1980s.
I see how it is.
So do you remember in late 1987, Howard Baker, after the Iran-Contra fiasco, comes in to kind of settle down the White House? Donald Reagan is out.
Oh, I love it, Connor.
When Baker came in, the Reagan people were saying, you need to be prepared to invoke the 4th article of the 25th Amendment,
Oh my God.
because the man no longer has it. I didn't know that, did you?
You know,
I know.
I knew I didn't know they were that far.
10
Dude,
push-ups.
don't worry, I'm giving half this away, I guarantee it.
I didn't know they were that far.
No, not the chips.
Matt, anything with
Give
your
me
music.
No, I mean.
It was weird. Well, I'll let you do your review.
I lost something. I can't.
Wait, whoa.
Have fun.
Why can't this not really? Can I have it?
How are you?
It's got Rice Crisps.
The 1980s?
Apparently.
Dude, you're gonna owe me $5.
You guys having a party?
The decade started off with the
Remember
I said I was gonna review it more?
What? Oh, I thought you said yesterday. Friday. Perfect. Let's come back then.
Let me eat this.
But not many people are here, so I'm a little annoyed.
Because there's a lot going on.
There's not that many.
I'm coming back.
Okay.
I need to go get my backpack.
Okay.
I need to put my name on this. Right.
Oh, we're still broadcasting.